Welcome to David and David on Real Estate. Join us as we explore the ins and outs of the real estate market.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the David and David on Real Estate podcast. We are today on episode number 48, and we have a very special guest with us today. We want to welcome Theresa Mersky. Good morning, Theresa, and welcome to the David and David on Real Estate podcast.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on.
Pleasure to have you with us, Theresa.
Yeah,
Anxious to hear all about you.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I've been telling David a little bit about your story and how we met, and we had some great conversation and a lot of commonalities, and we spoke about a lot of hot topics about the industry. One of them being business communication. But before we jump into all that fun stuff, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, of course. Well, I have lived in Canada now for 30 years, although I'm originally an American. And during most of my career, I worked for, well, at the time, what was Arthur Andersen, which became Accenture. And I worked in business consulting primarily. And with that, it was a great deal of emphasis on project management, particularly in large real estate developments or in large construction activities, particularly in New York City. When I moved to Canada, I went out on my own and I started a consulting business that was also sort of targeted into those areas, but it's expanded throughout the years where I've done a number of things, including working with a Tarion at times on when there's issues arise between builders and their clients. And so that's sort of been my bread and butter for a number of years. At this point in life, I'm kind of quasi-retired, I call it, but I still do the odd thing, particularly for some of my clients back in New York. And communication has been a big part of what that is. I've done a little bit of work in the real estate industry as well. And I've seen, not only how communication has changed and styles have changed over the last 20, 30 years, but the impact that that's had in industries that haven't been able to catch up.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. And I know you do some speech writing as well for some famous people.
I do some speech writing. That's sort of been my side gig for a long time. And I love it. I speech write for some politicians, and I also do some editing for other writers. And that's just something, quite honestly, I enjoy. So that's sort of it's become more of something I've been involved with more of late over the last, I'd say, 10 years. But that's often for CEOs as well. I write, or if it's their like annual general meeting, that kind of thing.
Wow, very cool. That's unbelievable. There's so much information there. I didn't really realize that you had so much experience or in the real estate world as well.
Yeah, well, through construction and through development. That's really where I've had a big part of my experience. And particularly back in the day, it was focused on project management. So working with teams and project coordinators and project managers on very large projects to learn how to effectively communicate to all stakeholders. So that's been a big part of what my core business was. And then recently here, I did get involved with the real estate agency, just working on ways to better identify how they were not only interacting with potential clients, but how they were ensuring that those potential clients remained with the firm. Oh, and that sort of a process by where we could kind of a deep dive on how, like, from initial contact, when someone calls an agency and says, I'd like to hire a real estate agent, to actually completing a transaction, what was that hit rate and where did it land? And we found it was actually quite low. So that was something that we worked on to develop, and we did increase it substantially.
Well, while you were talking on the real estate side of it, you mentioned that you were involved with Tarion. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious as to how you got involved with them and exactly what role you played with dealing with Tarion issues.
Well, I was working with a law firm that did some mediation work, and I really got involved on that side. And my role would be called in when there was situations that had escalated to the point where there seemingly was no resolution. You know, whether it was a situation with a builder or a situation at times even once there was with a real estate agent. And it was how to kind of get both sides back to the table and how to establish, you know, communications going forward. And that was a fascinating experience because, as you both know, when things go wrong, both sides feel often correct and they're willing to die on that hill. So it was really how to, as I put it, get people to lay down arms and come to the table in good faith negotiation.
Yeah, so I'm guessing, Theresa, that this was on, you know, large project type of mediation as opposed to just some home purchaser that's having a problem
Correct.
with the builder not getting some
exactly
deficiencies fixed up. You're looking at, you know, condo projects where there's a dispute between the developer and the condo corporation over, you know, major deficiencies over, you know, or allegations of you know, poor construction, things like that.
Yeah, correct. That and there were a few cases of really multi-million-dollar homes where there were issues, but more than not, it was, you know, directed at big scale developments, and particularly in the condo market. And it's a, you know, I have to say, I think it's a pretty flawed process as it currently exists. You know, it's designed, from my perspective, to create adversity. It's not really, there's not good processes in place at the most basic level. And I would say this is true whether developers or by purchasers, to have any sort of means of resolution that doesn't become conflict oriented. And it's an area I'd love to see change. You know, I think it's something that's just, it's going to become explosive because the condos that, you know, we're seeing going up, you know, as you see now, breakneck pace. In 10 years' time, we all know there's going to be pretty major issues, as there always is, or at least issues. And there's not a good mechanism in place currently outside of Tarion to get these things resolved. And it tends to become litigious very quickly.
And shouldn't the government of the day, you know, we're coming up to an election, but no matter who it is, and shouldn't they be consulting with someone like you as to how to fix it and how to fix the process that, you know, that's not working?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm not sure it should be me, but they certainly should be consulting with someone to, like, I think it's really, I think at the end of the day, what's happening is you don't have either stakeholder aren't being driven to find a solution. If you're the developer, you feel like, I see this all the time with developers, they have this sense that A, the building's great, you know, there's not going to be issues with their building. And B, if there are, you know, they have internal mechanisms to have it rectified. But in fact, when you have an issue, and let's say you're a condo buyer and you feel like there's major issues with your condo, and maybe your neighbors feel the same way, you at that point, there's no mediation mechanism outside of a court system to have outside arbitrators take a look at the situation and say, hey, no, these pipes aren't correct, or there is an issue, whatever, there's a water issue, there's a water pressure issue, that's often a big one. And now what we're going to see is these things age, is huge window issues. And there needs to be something that protects the right of the buyer and something that gives the developer an opportunity to make restitution without going through a court or a legal system. I'd love to see that happen. I don't know that it will. I think it's a ticking time bomb. I will say that. I do think it's a real ticking time bomb. That's certainly we're gonna find ourselves in here in a few years.
Yeah, David, I completely agree with you. I mean, we are coming up to an election, and you know, this is a hot topic item because we've been talking about, you know, condo systems and windows, and you know, a lot of these systems haven't even really been tested correctly, right? Because you know, condos are such a new phenomenon. Like, really, they've only really exploded in the last 15 years.
That's right.
And a lot of these systems, this is where the breakdowns really happen on the exponential rates where, roof and garage and leaks and windows, and balconies, and, a lot of this stuff has to be, really majorly maintained properly at this stage. And, who pays for it? And is it supposed to break down at such an exponential rate after 15 years, right? And I think this is where we're going to start seeing a lot of litigation happen, right? And,
sure.
and unfortunately, the homeowner is going to be caught in the middle of all of it, right? So I'd love to see our current government or, politicians really start addressing some of these hot button items. But, my office sold a record number of pre-construction properties in 2021, like an absolute record number. And we've had such low inventories in the marketplace that this is the only product that was available to purchase for buyers, right? So you're right. We're going to see lots of construction, lots of development happening. And as we do, we're going to see more and more issues arising because of it.
Well, having come from New York, where there's been a long history of condo or co-op ownership, particularly co-op, they have an excellent system sort of built in, and it's. I actually think in many ways the co-op system, which people don't care for, I actually think is better for a purchaser, because then a co-op board is because it is truly invested in the building, right? It's absolutely is joint ownership. So you do have a group of people who are completely connected with one common cause, and that's the maintenance and care of the building. In condos, you don't have that because, as you guys know, you've got individual ownership across numerous units, and you don't have that collectivity that I think that it takes to manage a building. And if you're a developer and you build a building and it's now 15 years down the road, and there is going to be maintenance. Even the best built buildings. I think in the condo scenario, and why it's not popular, by the way, in New York, I think, is just because of this. Because then, okay, how do we do this maintenance? How do we determine who pays for it? How do we ensure that the fees that are being collected by the board is really being used in the correct way? In many ways, I think the co-op method is better. It's just not part of what we do here, and I think people are reluctant to do it.
Yeah, no, there are very few co-ops in Toronto, as a whole. Like it's a very rare building that actually works on a co-op system. And one of the built-in flaws to the condo system is there's such mixed ownership use between, there's a big difference between being a homeowner living there in the condo, living there every day, looking at who wants to look after their building in their own unit, and all the rental units. And the attitude of landlords is completely different than the self-owner user in the system. They're not interested in being on the board. They're not interested in showing up at meetings. They want to pay as little as possible. It's pure business to them, and they're not invested the same way as someone that's living in the building.
That's exactly right. They may Airbnb it, or they may do all of these things that do go on, even if they're not supposed to. Where in the co-op model, you're extensively interviewed, and you're not allowed often to rent, or there's certain limitations on how you can do that. So while the co-op model obviously has flaws, which I get, certainly it makes for a better ownership experience, because you have a bunch of like-minded people who are working to achieve what's best for their building, rather than, and I think what you said, David, is absolutely right. Here we have buildings that are a mixture of folks who've moved in and plan to make it their home, and people who plan to rent them, and people who plan to flip them. And, they're just like, it's a crash waiting to happen.
Right. You got half the people, trying to create Airbnbs and trash the building, and the other half are trying to improve the building.
That's right.
So there's a real conflict, but the co-op has its flaws too, with
it does.
With getting in and key money issues and payments, and there's a lot of corruption within a lot of those buildings.
There are
things like that too. Like it's got those inherent dangers, when you create that type of system. But there's got to be something in between that would help. And and part of the key with all this, I guess, Theresa, is where you come in, is like you've got to communicate properly with people. You have to find a way.
You do. And I think, it starts with listening to what folks are saying. And I think any communication starts with, it's really listening. And I see that an awful lot in particularly, like, not to, stay focused on the condo market, but in that, I don't think that there's no mechanism set up for people to not only listen and be heard, but then also to do something that affects change. It's a very convoluted system. And you're right, the communication is often very poor, particularly from the developer to the homeowner. I think, as you probably know well, David, in the legal world, people are very afraid of being sued. So, that really affects how people communicate. And I think it frustrates people who are the homeowner. It frustrates everyone involved in it. Because there's sometimes just a real reluctance to come forth and say, the windows are flawed, and this is what we plan to do to fix them. Instead, it's, through some other sort of back channel messaging that might come from the window manufacturer. And at the end of the day, everyone's left, well, what's going to happen? And it's just not, like everything, it comes down to clear communication, which is missing.
Yeah. And look, Theresa, through your 30 years of doing this, like, how people communicate in the business world has completely changed, right? The way we communicated 30 years ago, for those of us that were in the business world then versus today, it's night and day. You'd never recognize it. Yes. And we tell the current generation about what we did. What you had an issue, you wrote a letter. Or phone calls, number one, which should still be the main communication. But you wrote a letter and mailed it out. Here's I know in the legal world, that's what we did. We wrote a letter and said, here's changes we want to the document. And then they invented the fax machine, and that was like life-changing.
Whoa. Yeah, I think it's so true. I say we're inundated with communication, but we're not hearing anything. Like there's almost too much communication. And I think people, like one of the things that we worked on when I was working with the real estate agency is to always say to your client, what type of communication do you prefer? Do you prefer a phone call? Do you prefer an email? Do you prefer, a text? Like, I think establishing what people are looking for is important. But when you're doing big communications, I think people often make the mistake of flooding whoever their audience is with communication, and they do it, and people don't read it. I'm amazed. And there was just a study, I think, that was done. I'm going to make it wrong. I think it was at Princeton, where they found that people who were given updates daily took in less information than people who were giving updates weekly, because they either skim it or they don't read it, or it's just not, it's just not something that is resonating. Where, I always say, obviously, the most important form of communication is to ensure it's correct. What you're saying is absolutely correct, but also concise. And I see an awful lot of communications. I get emails as well that just go on for days. And at some point I zone out in reading them. And I think there's also just, the idea of distracted communication, which is what I think of as where people aren't, I'm constantly saying to people in consulting, pick up the telephone, make a call. Human voice, actually, because tone, intonation is, as you guys know, is key to the kingdom. Something can be written and it can sound what, and you can hear it and it can sound completely different. And that's, I think, it's becoming, oddly enough, a lost form of communication.
Well, I agree 100%. I'm no expert on communication, but I can tell you from my experience, and I push it with our lawyers and the clerks too, like, pick up the phone, especially when something's contentious. When something's routine, you can deal with it with emails. But as soon as something gets contentious, the best way to diffuse it is with a phone call. I did one on Friday. We had on a transaction where we're going back and forth, and our client is getting frustrated with us. Nothing happened at our end, but we have a problem on the other side in our transaction. They're not ready to close, and we're trying to communicate when they can close and what terms and extension and blah, blah, blah. But, we're keeping our client informed by copying them on all these things, but they don't understand some of the legalese that's going back and forth. They're getting frustrated. They all of a sudden they start turning on us. They think we're not doing our job properly. How come I've got to deal with all these issues? All I want to do is close my transaction. And maybe they were copied too much with all these emails that they didn't understand. And they don't understand exactly what our strategy is and everything. And I'm being copied on. It's not my fault. Other lawyers on it and clerks, but I'm being copied on it. And finally I said, okay, like I gotta stop this, because now our client's getting nasty to us, saying you're not doing your job, your firm's not. I said, okay, nobody do anything. I gotta call the client. And I called and I spent 20 minutes with them. I said, this is what we're trying to do. This is the strategy. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're doing. This is how we're protecting you. This is just taking a legal position. This isn't what the end result is, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is in 20 minutes, like he got off when he was so happy, like so at ease, because they were going crazy. And there's no way that I could have diffused that by sending him another email that went on for pages to try and explain it to him.
No.
And it was worth the phone call.
Always. And I think to your point, we overshare communication, via email particularly. I think when, if I hire you as my lawyer, in reality, I don't want to see how the sausage is made. I want to hear, where are we, David?
Right.
Is there a problem? What's your plan?
Right.
And I think we've really come to this point, and I see it an awful lot in real estate and even the transactions I've been involved in. I've felt to myself, you're sharing too much, like I might be able to sort through this and understand, but I can see where others are going to get immediately on edge or worked up, or what does this mean? And I think, the idea of someone who's, when you sign on to represent someone, whether it's an agent or a lawyer, is your job is to protect your client from that and then provide them with, sort of minimal, concise communication that's clear and careful, and not, keeping everybody aware of every little bump in the road. And unfortunately, that's become almost norm. And I think I always say it's the dreaded CC. There's always this need to add in, because you feel like, oh, I'm keeping my client, I'm communicating, but you're not communicating. That's not, from my perspective, that's not communication. That's just oversharing of complex, issues that really the person has hired you to perform. That, from my perspective.
Theresa, how can agents, take what you just shared, and how can they really improve their communication?
Well, I think first and foremost is to have the one-on-one. I just can't stress this enough. Like, too much communication is flowing through tech devices, the quick text or through the email. And I think so much of that, it has to be, done more in person or on the telephone. That should be number one. And I think number two, also, I think, so much communication, I think breakdowns that happen and I think in real estate in particular, is agents aren't listening carefully to what the client is saying. I saw this when I gave the example earlier of clients where a firm was finding from first call to actual transaction, numbers were very low. And that was, from my review, I could tell that the client would call and say, well, I want a $2 million cottage and I really want a sunset, and these are the deal breakers. And then they're shown things that aren't in that basket at all. And, this just leads to frustration, right? The people just get frustrated by what's going on. And so much of it is not listening. The other thing is, I find so many people now, and this is true about and everything I consult in, are distracted. So not only are they not listening, they're distracted, they're thinking or doing something else, or looking at something else. So they're distracted and they're not really clued in and focused on the moment. And people pick up on that. I think that's the thing that we forget, is that if you're someone on the other side, you want to be made to feel, and for lack of a better word, important, because you are. You want to feel that you're being heard and that you listen to, and that it's important. But distracted communication is terrible, and I really see it in emails, because people will quickly fire off an email that it doesn't always answer the question, then there's a follow-up saying, well, wait a minute, well, I also asked X. So that it's not like you were saying, David, you wrote a letter. It took time. You had to read what you were doing. You had to answer all the questions because you couldn't just fire off another letter. So it's just this really lack of careful communication that just flies back and forth. So those are the things I try to get people to do, and obviously there's a conversation where you say, what's the form of communication you like, David? How do you like for me to talk to you? Would you prefer that I would prefer to call you so that we always have clarity, but then at times, would you prefer an email? Would you a text? How often do you want to hear from me? Like, that's a question people never ask, I find, and that's a mistake because, every client's different. And some are like, I want to hear from you when you've got something for me and not before. I don't need to be babysat. And others are really, perhaps they do want more of that. And I think those are questions that are so key in this industry. It's key everywhere.
Yeah. That's such a great point.
Tip that I was taught years ago by a guy who was basically a salesman. He sold different things throughout his life. And then I was working with him, and he was running a financial management company. But he said, when you call somebody, he says, the first thing you should do when they answer the phone is be, hi, Theresa, it's David calling. Did I reach you at a good time?
Yes.
And he would insist that everybody ask that because everybody's busy and you just never know when to pick up the phone. Did you catch them good? Because you really want their attention.
That's right.
You want them to know that, that you want to spend a couple minutes with them. And if it's not a good time, let's set up a good time to talk.
That's right.
As opposed to having a rush conversation where they just can't wait till, what do you want? I got to get you off the phone because I got, my kids are screaming at me or I got something on the stove, right?
Yeah, there's nothing worse than answering the phone and the person jumping right in and you're in the midst of whatever. I actually say this is a good time for a text, to text and say, I'd like to have a call. Let me know what's good.
What's a good time?
Yeah, that's always a really good time. That's a good use of my viewpoint of a text. And then you're so right. And also when when we're in those situations too, to not jump immediately into what it is you're calling about. Hello, how are you? I see this an awful lot, and I hate to say it in the younger generation, makes me sound so old, but they jump right in, to whatever it is. And, your headspace has got to get there a little bit. If I'm in the midst of a real estate transaction, I would think someone would go, hi, Theresa, how are you? What's going on today? So here's where we are. And also have a plan in your head before you call someone. I think that, write down 3 or 4 key things that you want to say, because you can get lost in a conversation. And I that's the other real tip I try to give, particularly young agents, is, when you're talking to someone, let's be really clear on what your communication plan is, because you should always have one, even if it's a conversation, to say, I want to talk about A, B, and C. And I think that's important and not done enough. They pick up the phone, they call, and then the conversation kind of goes. And then also, the other thing I think, and you spoke about it earlier, when there's conflict, anticipating what the answer might be and start to think before you call of what your response will that be. If you have to share bad news and you realize, well, what I'm going to get an answer here that's going to be very difficult. Think in your mind before you call of what you want to get across. And I think, because the communication now is so rushed and it's so prevalent and so easy. And the one thing about the cell phone, you used to too, you had to go and sit at your desk and pick up the phone and make a call. But now you could just hit a number and boom, you reach someone. And there's not enough thought given into, these kinds of calls. I stress with people all the time that the kind of communication we're talking about is not personal communication, it's business communication, and it always needs to be viewed in that vein. But right now there's such a, they've collided in a way that's a mishmash of both, and it's not to everyone's betterment, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I love the point that you made about, asking people how often they want to be communicated to. I think that's something we don't do enough. And I think that's something that I'm definitely going to incorporate into, my communication moving forward, because I think it's really important, right? Because, everybody has their own communication styles,
They
right?
do.
But what's important is what communication style does your customer have, and what did they expect from you? Because a good business will, adapt to your customer's communication style to, make the best customer experience for them, right? It's all
That's
about
right.
them at the end of the day. It's not about you. And, a lot of people make communication about themselves.
They do. And I think, there's a rule of thumb that, I say this to people all the time, in any industry, we're all salesmen at the end of the day, right? And so you want to be an effective salesman, but, I wouldn't let a client go cold for, like, if I'm a real estate agent and I'm looking for something over, let's say 7 days have gone by. Now, I would reach out and say, just checking in, letting you know, here's where we are. And then you move on. But I've heard this from a lot of people. I actually just, funny enough, just last night I was at a dinner where someone was telling me they fired their agent because she constantly was sending them, like, it was just sending them just a wrath of every possible listing, when he was very clear. He's a very busy guy. He's a very successful guy. And he's like, this is exactly what I want. And if it's not that, I don't want to see it. And she didn't hear that. And so, continued to send and send and send. And he got frustrated and has now moved on, although did not share with her why, which I wish he would have. But I think that does happen. I do think it happens quite a lot.
Yeah, and it's too bad for the agent that communication, that they didn't communicate that, like, here's the problem I've got with you, because you have to learn from those situations.
You do.
Too. Like, anytime that we have a client that gets upset with us for something, I love it when they actually reach out and say, hey, I got a problem with your clerk, I got a problem with your lawyer, I got a problem with you, because at least you get a chance to address it and fix it. You might save it with that particular client, but at least you can fix it. Because maybe it's a systematic problem. Maybe it's a problem that somebody's communication style isn't good, but at least you get a chance to know about it and make an improvement. So I always really, really appreciate it when someone, even if they don't like our service for some reason, and David knows everybody likes our service.
Who wouldn't?
But we do have, things go off the rails sometimes. We're only human, but it's fabulous when they do reach out and say, hey, look, we're ready to move on, but I want you to know what happened, and this is what happened, and you got no chance of saving this, but you should know what's going on there, right?
Yeah, and 90% of the time that doesn't happen. People just move on. So, because people hate conflict, and they hate to be, they have a hard time delivering that message. And I agree with you, Dave. It's the best feedback you can get. And one of the communication tools I try to instill in folks is to take the temperature, I call it. So every now and then say, hey, how are we doing here? Are we, is there anything we need to work on? Is there anything we need to share? It's really an important question that doesn't get asked nearly enough. We just assume it's good, or it's bad and we don't want to touch it, one or the other. But I think it's absolutely imperative, particularly to your juniors and to your younger agents, just to say, because I find when, I just worked with someone in the Bahamas recently who's a young real estate agent there, and I was really taken with him because he said to me repeatedly, look, I'm new at this, so please just tell me, if this is if I'm not doing what you need, if I'm just please. And every couple of weeks he sort of says to me, am I doing this for you the way you need it done? And I really appreciate that, right? Because then I feel like I could tell this kid anything. I could say to him, no, not that, or yes, this, but you're the one who has to invite that. I think to your point, David, it's like we all want it, but we don't invite it. We don't open the door and make it clear that, hey, we really do want your feedback. Feedback is like, it's one of those terms that gets thrown out there, and you can't go on a website without having a survey pop up about your feedback. But in reality, we don't actually invite it. We don't make it clear that we're really willing to hear what you want to tell us. Like, that's not part of what people do nearly enough of.
Yeah, and I don't like just to wait for a Google review. Like, it's too late at that point. Like, you can't do anything about it, right? Whether it's good or bad. It's, I get it's important in today's day and age. People are checking out that way, but that's not the feedback that really helps.
No, it is. And it's just, as I said, the majority of time you won't get it. The majority of time people, and I've seen situations where I've spoken with past clients of various firms, and they'll say, and the person who they serve said, oh, I think that client's very happy. When I've talked to the client, in fact, they aren't, but they just never voiced it. They don't say, they're like, no, we won't use them again, and here's why. And most of the things I find are pretty fixable. It's rare that there's a situation. I mean, you and I, David, talked about sometimes there's a mismatch of personalities, and particularly in the real estate business, and I think that's a critical area that needs, and also I think David, in the legal, industry, in all industry, these things are personal one-on-one experiences that if myself and the lawyer aren't meshing, just aren't personality wise, or the agent aren't personality wise, I so wish that would be so much more recognized and not seen as a fail by the agent or the lawyer, and rectified by moving to someone who is a better fit. Because there's also backsplash from not in the kitchen, but there's a backlash to the agents or to the employee, because they're worried that by saying, I'm not getting along with Sam or whatever it is, they're going to say, well, why not? Why aren't you? And instead of saying, well, this may not be a fit. And I think that's something that has to come from the top a bit more, and is really missing in many industries, including real estate, I believe.
Yeah, we actually see it a lot on the brokerage level, where a complaint gets escalated to senior management, and we're able to get on the phone and very quickly direct the client to another agent in the brokerage. Mm-hmm. And within a week, the customer has bought a house, has sold their condo, and they're extremely happy. And we've took a really negative situation that potentially could have led to a complaint and completely de-escalate the situation. And not only do we de-escalate it, but we've turned it into a very positive situation with the clients as well, right? And I mean, we have a large brokerage. We have 230 realtors. That's 230 different personalities. That's at least 40 different languages. That's a world of different experiences. And I love the fact that you brought this up, Theresa, because you're absolutely right. There is no sense in forcing a relationship if it's just not there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make you good or bad. It makes us all different. It makes us all unique, right? And it's this idea of vulnerability and being vulnerable with each other and just communicating. And it's okay if that's the case. Let's just talk to one another and make sure that we're adults and professional about it, and we can move you to a different person and make that experience completely different for you.
Yes, and I think that really comes from encouraging all of those brokers to feel like they can raise their hand and say, I don't think I'm a fit here. And I think, I call this sort of, all these type of businesses are almost emotional businesses, whether it's buying a home or even in the legal world, these are usually emotional matters that you're dealing with. And to not think that we don't need a fit of personalities is kind of crazy, right? I mean, because you do. And not recognize that sort of in management, and to make those young brokers be aware of it too, that if it's not going well, for them to be able to go to someone more senior and say, this isn't really going well, and here's and for that person to say, what, I don't think you're the right fit here. You're this type of broker, and they're wanting to have their hand held, and they want sort of this other experience, and you're more of a let's get it done, go kind of person. And I think, because so much of this, right, so much of what we're trying to do in a client relationship of any kind is develop a relationship, and not everybody can develop a relationship, and that's really just part of the human condition, and it's not a fail often. I mean, you could obviously have experiences where someone their communication style isn't right for anyone, and that's different. But I do think that needs to be, there's like a lot of great reading, by the way, that you can do around determining what kind of personality fit is best for you. For someone who's working in sales, And I think it's excellent for people to do, because it tells them, okay, I'm really best with a young new homeowner who's trying to buy their first house, who doesn't know anything about real estate. It's going to need a lot of handholding. Or no, I'm better with someone who's done this a million times, is efficient, wants to get it done. And as you know, there's brokers for all that type, and not one should have to be both, because it typically doesn't work, I don't think.
Yeah, and there's some agents that deal more with, like, as David knows, with investors.
Yes.
So if you're someone used to dealing with investors who look at it purely as business opportunities, they're not the same person that's going to handhold that first-time buyer that's interested in where's the park and where's the school.
Yes.
And are there other kids on the street for my kids to play with? And they don't have the same patience for dealing with those type of issues, because they're looking at a house as they're looking at the dollars and cents.
Exactly.
So it's just the wrong, still good agents, doing great jobs, but not the right fit.
And that's 90% of it, I think. If you get that part of the equation right, the rest of it are all these things you can be. But if you don't get that part right, if I'm a young, family and I've got 3 kids, I'm worried about schools, and I'm dealing with a young broker who's, maybe never married and young and out there and just used to selling condos for investment purposes, that's not going to work. It just isn't. And I think, because I always find in feedback, particularly in real estate, but when you look in feedback from happy clients, it's like, oh, Joe was great. He really heard me. And not only that, like, he helped my kid get into hockey, or, whatever it might be. Like, those are the things that, like, but that all comes down to fit. And at the end of the day, again, it needs to be something that becomes ingrained in your institution, and it's not seen as a punishment for when it doesn't work.
Well, it sounds to me that one of the keys I'm taking away from you, Theresa, is that one of the biggest keys to communication is not what you're saying or what you're doing, it's how you're listening.
Yeah. Oh, it's honestly, this ought to be my mantra is, people, we don't listen. We're not good listeners. We think we are, but we're not. And it's hard, quite honestly. It's really hard to be a good listener. You're thinking about what you're going to say next. You're thinking about, you may be thinking about what you're going to be doing tonight, or, your mind goes in a million different ways. It's super hard to concentrate and focus and really listen to what someone's saying, because there's particularly in your businesses, there's so much information you want to convey. You also want to win the day. You want to make them like you. And the best way you can do that is to listen and ask questions about them, right? To sort of ensure that you are the right person and ensure that what you're going to do for them is the best. One of something I did once in New York just a few years ago is we did a really interesting sort of test, if you will, where we sent in, people who were saying they were there to, buy a condo or whatever. And we gauged how many questions they were asked. And they were asked relatively few, which we found really fascinating, right? Because you would think you've got someone new in front of you, you have a million questions for them about their lifestyle, about where they want to live, about what, and we found that the better agents did. They asked a million questions. They really drilled down on the person. They didn't talk about themselves a lot in that first meeting. And I think that's such an important thing, because someone who's going to do this, they really want to tell you everything. They want to tell, they want to get it right. They want to share. But, asking questions and listening, and the act of asking questions, by the way, forces you to listen. So it's a good technique to get particularly younger people to do, because if they have to ask questions, it engages your brain in a different way than if you were just having a conversation.
Yeah, I could actually really relate to that when I was out there selling real estate. And one of the reasons is I never liked talking about myself, right? So in my first meeting with the customer, I always wanted to know everything about them. I always made all my meetings about them, but it worked really, really well for me because, part of understanding who they are as a family and where they work and, what they do for fun and, where they spend their time made my job a lot easier. I could really narrow down the neighborhoods, and I could really understand, where they're looking for. And I always showed them, houses that were really very relevant.
Mhm.
And the other thing, which, was a little bit of a curse, is I always found them the perfect house. And I say that it was a little bit of a curse because, a lot of my customers to this day have still not moved. They still live in the same house I sold them, years and years and years ago. Now, I always get referrals, which is great. It's a sign that you did a great job, but that curse follows me around, and I laugh about it a little bit, but I think it's a testament to, listening and really getting to know your client.
It is. And I say another part of communication is creativity. So, and being creative in the way you speak. I remember someone gave me advice once at dinner parties, rather than sitting down and what do you do? Where do you live? This sort of conversation we've all gone through, maybe ask a questions like, or maybe say, hey, you know what? Why don't you tell me all about your mother and I'll tell you all about mine? And so you launch right away into a conversation I can almost guarantee you is always going to be interesting. And it's not that day-to-day mundaneness, that we've all kind of like those conversations happen on rote. This is what I do, this is what we do. So think of ways to be creative in your communication, particularly with your clients. And that can come about in a number of ways to get to know each other, ways to also, they may say, I only want to live in this neighborhood. And you can be creative in your communication by saying, I think this is great. I will give you other options and you can turn them down. But, I think it's my job to say, here's something that's very similar to that neighborhood that might be more affordable, and you can reject them. But I do think ways of being creative and how we talk to folks is important, because it makes the person also wake up from, I always call it dead zone communication. Hi David, what do you do? Where do you live? How many kids do you have? Like that, that's like, it's communicating, but it's dead zone communication. But if you can find ways to really make your communication a little more interesting, and it might be an interesting anecdote about real estate or something around yourself that they might find amusing. I mean, humor is, we haven't talked about it, but humor is huge. And it's not, it is it's the golden ticket in my perspective of communication, particularly when you're in tough scenarios or whatever, but correctly used, that is people will instantly like you if you make them laugh. And so, there's all these things that I think we're talking now about. Once we're sort of doing the basics, what is the little bits of communication that add the spice and can make a relationship really strong?
Yeah, I think humor just helps to relax people, diffuse them a little bit. Show that we can all be business-like, and that's
absolutely.
And maybe they're in contact you by reputation because you've got a business reputation, but you have to show the human side of you, that we all have lives, we've all got families, we've all got personal interests, and you have to show that sometimes for people to say, yeah, this is just what I happen to do. I do this, and Theresa does that, and David Gorski does something else, but we all then go away and we have families and we have a personal life too.
That's right.
You have to let your guard down a little bit and show that.
Absolutely. I think, David, that's so true, because that's then when connections will happen. When you kind of drop the veil a little bit, just to sort of say, hey, here's something about me that is human. I forgot my kid at daycare and went flying across the city last night, or whatever it might be. Because I think, particularly that, back to not keep beating up on tech communication, it's hard to be funny or human in email or text. You can a little bit.
Yes.
First of all, you can't gauge, whether or not you're landing, but it's really difficult to be any of those things when you're not with someone or on the phone with them. And that's such a missing part of what makes a strong relationship. I share with people who are looking in communication, you can look at almost any dating app when a hit happens, and it's always, they made me laugh, is always in the top 2 or 3 things that people say about some partner that they've met and like. And that's true, I think, about everyone. And not everyone maybe has the tools to display humor in a business setting the way they should, but they certainly have the tools to display humanity or bits about themselves or things that can be relatable, which I think is a huge, huge thing in communication. Is you want to feel like, because you change your communication, and you guys know this with someone you like, even your voice changes, all kinds of your body language changes, everything changes because you feel like, oh, I get this person, like right away, I see the shift all the time.
Yeah, and that's why like texts are, to me, so dangerous. So and emails too. We had a clerk that's now retired, lovely lady, and in there I was like she was funny. She was always looking for the humor and everything. There was an interaction amongst us in the office, or when she was communicating with a client on the phone. Like she was always looking for, because that was just her personality. She was so natural of it, but she was trying to do the same thing in her emails, and she got in trouble because they were being misinterpreted, miscommunicated. Yeah. You can't tell me she's smiling. Just putting a smiling emoji at the end of it doesn't do it sometimes, No. And she was getting in trouble with some clients that were really getting upset with her because they didn't understand what her humor was doing. I'd read it and I go, oh, I know what she's doing because I know her. And I said, and we had to sit down because you can't do that anymore. If you want to have that type, you got to pick up the phone and do it in a conversation where they can understand that you're joking, that you're laughing as you're saying it. They can hear your tone. You can't read a tone in an email.
No, there's no intonation in email at all. And it's not the place for humor typically. I mean, there's occasions, but for the most part, it's not. And so that is removing a big part of our personal communication. So if you're only, communicating with someone by email or text, you're removing all these things that typically build relationships, whether it's humor or a human connection or the ability to respond to something and say, oh, no, David, wait. No, I did not mean that. I meant, oh, I'm so sorry. Glad whoa. Like you don't have the ability to do that. And it's dry, flat communication is a term that gets used a lot. And it kind of is laying there somewhat dead. And most of us aren't novelists. So we're not able to add intonation in our writing in a way that's going to work. And so I try to I think people should really focus on email as just a means of conveying basic information and not much more. But don't look for it as a replacement for building a relationship, because it won't typically work.
Yeah, look, if we were just to transcribe this podcast, we're in 50 minutes of it now, and someone just read it, they wouldn't enjoy it or get the same things out of it by listening to it or watching it, because they wouldn't hear our voices, they wouldn't see our facial expressions. Like, it's a whole different means of communication, right? So the content is the same, but you get a completely different message, right?
That's absolutely correct. There's a great website called Letters of Note. I may have seen it, but it's letters that have been written throughout history on various topics. I love reading it. And what's interesting in reading those letters, is back then the letters were like a story. The letters weren't the type of communication that we do today, which is, and these would be letters from a lawyer to a client sometimes, or they could be anything. And they're much more of the writing is highly effective at conveying both emotion and conveying thoughts and conveying feelings, all kinds of things. And that isn't the kind of writing that we do today. It's really almost become a lost art, which is unfortunate. And I sometimes coach people, if you make an attempt every now and then to write a letter instead of an email. Because there is a tone change that happens in your head when you're writing a letter. I think for a lot of young people, they don't even know what that is, but it is something to think about, because I think it does it can change your type of communication if you're going at it more as an informative letter, and rather than this, here's what's going on. Your transaction has this problem. Here below me is 17 more emails that went back and forth. You can read those. It's terrible.
Yeah, I think 98%, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a huge percentage of all communication is non-verbal, right? So you need to see the body language. You need to see, the hand gestures and the reactions and the smile and the energy and, and you just don't get that in a text message or an email.
Yeah.
The same is true about family relationships and personal relationships. And like to me, the best way to communicate with my own kids and now my grandkids is to get them for a weekend in Muskoka.
Yes.
How's that for a segue?
Yes, Muskoka.
Well done, David. Well done.
So why don't
I
you
know
tell
this
us
is
your
one of those
connection?
topics that you were really looking forward to.
I just want, the rest of it was just filler to get to the talking about Muskoka.
So yes, Muskoka, we've had a cottage up on Lake Rosso for 25 years now. When we first moved to Canada, we rented up there. I bought a long time ago, back when prices were, I think you could have bought all of Muskoka for $1 million when we bought it. And, so it was kind of a different time. We have a very old, tiny little cottage, but it's on a group of islands. It's quite charming and lovely. But we were involved in something interesting on the real estate front this past couple of years. My husband, myself, and another couple, Don and Karen Ling, who we were neighbors with. There's a big island in Lake Rosso called Highland Island. And Seth and I had actually rented that island 30 years ago. And it was the largest undeveloped island in Lake Rosso. And the family sold it. And the first person who bought it was a developer. And the idea was to turn it into 16 to 18 lots. And so it's going to be quite a dense development. And we knew the owner. That development got into trouble and kind of started to fall apart a bit. So we stepped up and with the other persons bought the island. And we joke about this. We say, when you're willing to not make any money, you can compete with developers. So our goal wasn't to make money. It was really to sort of preserve some of this beautiful old island. So we donated half of the island, the back half, to the Muskoka Conservancy. And it's, I think, the largest donation that's been made on Lake Rosso. And then we divided the rest of it into two very large lots. It can actually go into four. There's two of them are actually current. One sold, one half of it, the other half is currently for sale. And it's really been a great project that I've felt good about on a number of levels. There's, as you guys know, there's huge amounts of development going on in Muskoka. I'm certainly not anti-development, but I do have a concern. There's 10,000 lakes in Lake Ontario, and I don't believe that all that development has to happen on these three. And so this was our way of sort of getting involved and doing something that hopefully has a long-term impact.
So what'll happen with the half of the island that you donated? How's that going to be used?
So it's becomes just a nature conservatory. People can visit it. I don't know that people actually do. It's wonderful for the people who bought on the island because it's like a protected buffer that will be there, for forever. And so it really provides, sort of needed green space that we're losing in Muskoka at a really rapid rate. I mean, everyone goes up to see the rock and the trees, and what we're really losing an awful lot of that. So it is open to the public. People can go and hike on it should they desire, but it's really there just to preserve. This is a 55-acre island. It's a huge island.
Wow.
So 25 acres that is really not going to be built upon. And I think, it's important to me that, I've been up there a long time, that kind of the heritage of the place. I mean, there's no sort of historical preservation at all in Muskoka, which I find kind of disappointing because there are some beautiful old cottages that I hate to see what might happen to. And I think, we've got to keep in mind what's drawing. I don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg by developing in a way that's not simpatico with what the use of the place is. And so there is definitely like a lot of tension, as you guys know, right now in Muskoka around this topic. I worry because I'm not so sure the politicians are really thinking this through. I don't think there's any grand plan for what needs to be accomplished in Muskoka and how we do preserve some of the green space.
I completely agree. I mean, I've been looking at the Three Lakes for about 3 years now, and it's a bucket list item for me to have a cottage in Muskoka. I know a lot of people, and one of my really close friends and mentors has a place on Lake Roseau, and I love going up there. It's very different. It's hard to describe to people who haven't been to Muskoka, but it has a form of magic to it, and it brings people together on a very deep and impactful level, right? And having a cottage is a very Canadian thing as well.
It is, we say it's the best thing we've ever bought because our kids grew up there. It's the only thing we've owned for a long period of time. And and I love that in Canada. This is changing a bit, but used to be there were cottages at price points for almost everyone, so that you had cottage ownership really across in so many levels. In Muskoka, that's becoming now out of reach. I'm amazed at what's happened there price wise. But, I still believe, though, we still have this cottaging tradition that can happen at, numerous lakes throughout. And I love it. It's one of the things that I grew up in the Ozarks. And so it's something that I feels almost home to me being up there.
Let me ask you this question, because I've been looking for a really long time in Muskoka. And, whenever I come across an island property, I always skip it. I never really give it.
Big mistake.
Right.
Huge mistake. Yeah. I say this to people all the time. You're letting convenience outweigh romance.
Right.
It's like you go up there for the experience. Like you want to live differently. I park my car and I do not get in it almost all summer if I can avoid it. I go everywhere by boat. It forces you to have to live differently. And the slight inconvenience is part of the magic of it. The minute I step in that boat, I'm away. And I feel it. Like it's like a mental shift. I'm in the boat and I'm gone. And you also get privacy. I think that's the thing that people really have, really don't understand. By being on an island, you typically have either bigger properties or you have the whole island if it's a little island. And you get a tremendous amount of privacy. You get a tremendous amount of, it feels adventurous, for lack of a better word. And I've heard people say, oh, you have to shop the groceries twice, whatever. Come on. Like part of this is what is the magic that you talk about, right?
How long a boat ride do you have from the mainland to the cottage? How far?
We have a really good situation, and I should make that clear, but we do own some land on the mainland because this is a very old place. So it's been there for a long time. So we're like a 10-minute boat ride. So it's very, very quick. And I think that does obviously go a long way. But quite honestly, in Muskoka, the lakes aren't so big. I think if anybody has 15 minutes,
Right.
Typically they're not particularly long.
Yeah, and there's a ton of islands, and I've been cottaging in Muskoka for over 40 years, and what we do, my wife and we just like get in the boat and we just trace the shores and just looking to see what's new and just love it. But I'm always amazed, like we're on mainland, we're not islanders, but we've always been fascinated, with how they do it, because you have to be organized for sure. Right. You got to get, because you're not making, like I would just be making trips every 10 minutes back and forth. So I forgot something, but I think one of the issues I could never do is I've always been a runner. So I can't be on an island. I have to get in a boat and go to the mainland to go for a run. I don't have an
well, my daughter's a runner and she does that all the time now. It's like it becomes second nature. The other thing is we grocery shop by boat a lot. So we'll go into Port Sanville or somewhere. We we do that often by boat. I try to do most everything by boat, but it becomes, it's hard to describe, but it just becomes part of what you do, and you don't get in the car so much, which means you do kind of, you are disconnected a bit more. You are like, here we are, we're on the island.
Right.
And sometimes it's pouring rain when you go across and stuff happens. But I wish more people would consider it. It's funny, we rented the very first place that turned out to be an island, which it's a long story, but I didn't realize when I rented. It was back in the day when you rented with a phone call and you got very little information. And I liked it immediately. And I'll never forget, it's the only time it's ever happened to me with a real estate agent. We walked in and I said, they're talking about things. And I said, well, I know I can't afford it, but what about an island? And they go, oh, those are cheaper. I almost passed out because I don't think that's ever happened to me before.
You were surprised.
Shocked.
Well, and the
They are
biggest sales
cheaper
you see on the lakes is pontoon boats.
Yes.
Right? Like that's the hottest type of boat up there, because everyone needs a pontoon to get their stuff to the island and cruise around, and they've just become more sophisticated, those boats, and
They have,
and they're pleasure crafts now, in addition to just
I know, it's very
people
crazy.
movers and
Yeah,
and grocery
It's
movers.
true. Yeah, it's true. No, we just have an old dirty metal boat that we go back and forth in, but
Yeah, no, but there's something about it. There's every island's got people on it, and every time we cruise by, say, oh, those people are having a relaxing time. They're out there reading a book, and
yeah, no, I try to convince people all the time, and the people I've convinced, people who typically become islanders or become a hardcore islander, and that's just the way that it goes. But no, I mean, I've seen such changes up there. It's been remarkable. It really has been remarkable. And I don't know where, I mean, I guess everyone's concerned right now with where interest rates are going and what's going to happen with these markets, but it's an incredibly hot market at the moment.
Yeah, I think a market like Muskoka, I mean, I do think there might be some adjustments, but I mean, you're also, talking to people that are very well off and where money is not that big of an issue. So I think those markets are going to be a little bit more resilient than other markets. And, I think there's, a barrier to entry for a reason. I mean, it is extremely sought after. Hollywood stars have cottages in Muskoka, and they come up there for a week and that's it. And they can justify paying all that money and holding on to the cottage just for that 1 week experience. So I mean, if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, I don't know what else will.
That's the biggest change I've seen, because when I first went out there, that wasn't the case.
Right.
And it was, I think market value assessment really changed it. A lot of people couldn't afford to hold on to it and pass it on. So yeah, that has been a very major change. And back then there weren't a lot of rental. Now so many people are renting cottages, which is like what we spoke about before, sort of if you live in a condo, you really don't want your next door neighbor to be renting out their cottage every week, because that's going to be a nonstop party. So those issues are up there. They for sure are. There's big boats, and there's issues that go with that, and it's changed really dramatically.
Yeah, but like David said, the stars are up there too, and a lot of professional athletes, a lot of NHL players, cottage.
Yeah, all around me.
Yeah, and Goldie Hawn was on your lake, and she was one of the first ones everybody sort of knew about was there, and then Steve Martin and Martin Short, and you bump into those people up there, and a whole bunch of others, and then all the NHL guys are all up there.
Yeah, no, it's like I said, it's been a dramatic shift. Probably over the last 10 years, it's been a very, very dramatic shift. So it's for good and bad. I mean, there's it's pluses about it. I mean, but you can lose some things too, and that's why I felt like this conservancy is such an important thing up there, to try to maintain some of it, to try to keep some of to not overdevelop. Which I think not only would be harmful to the lakes, but also just harmful to the region.
So let me ask you this question, and this is to both of you. What have you guys run into any celebrities in Muskoka?
Yeah, I have. Goldie Hawn used to be just north of us, and I do see a lot of NHL players, and so yeah, we have. I'm on probably quite a few occasions now. Cindy Crawford is on Lake Joe. I've seen her at things. So yeah, there's definitely become a clientele that you bump into for sure, who I would say mostly are very respectful owners.
Yeah, I saw Jonathan Hacohen up there once, big celebrity.
It's his business partner.
Yeah, that's not really the world I run in either. It's not, we've seen them around, but no, we pretty much hang out on our little island and barbecue.
That's amazing. Well, Theresa, listen, this is so great. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, such an important topic, and who would have known that business communications can take up, such a long segment of the podcast, but, very needed. And I think it's, something that a lot more agents, especially young agents, but I mean, agents of all caliber should really be paying attention to, and lots of great tips. So thank you so much for joining us. And it was an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I'm passionate about communication and forums, and you just said for younger people as well, because I feel like they're really not getting the opportunity to learn how to communicate. And I hope as business owners, everyone starts to kind of understand that and helps to make that part of your training. I think it's missing in their lives, and it's missing in business. So I'm glad we had a chance to chat. Thank you. You're both really interesting. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise.
Well,
thank you so
thanks,
much.
Theresa.
Thank you. Bye.